Thunder boomed across the Montana sky as Hank Montgomery stared at the smoldering remains of what had once been his life. The ranch house that had sheltered his wife and child was now nothing but charred timber and ash, ravaged by the lightning strike that had set it ablaze during last night's terrible storm. His fingers trembled as he clutched his weathered Stetson against his chest, knees sinking into the mud as the rain continued to fall in a gentle mockery of the violent tempest that had claimed everything he loved. Montana Territory, 1876. Hank had built this homestead with his own two hands after returning from the war between the states, determined to make a new life far from the bloodshed he'd witnessed. For 5 years, he and Sarah had worked the land, raised cattle, and brought their daughter Emma into the world. Now, at 32, he was alone again, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the horse that had been safely sheltered in the distant barn during the fire. Days passed in a blur of grief. Hank barely registered the passage of time as he worked mechanically to clear the debris and bury what remained of his family in a small plot beneath the cottonwood tree, where Sarah had loved to read to Emma on summer afternoons. He couldn't bring himself to rebuild. Instead, he constructed a small, crude shelter at the edge of his property, away from the ruins that haunted his every waking moment. The neighboring homesteaders came to pay their respects, offering help, food, and company, but Hank turned them all away. He couldn't bear their pitying looks or well-meaning words. What did they know of his loss? How could they possibly understand the hollow ache that consumed him from within? Better to be alone with his grief than to endure their awkward attempts at comfort. Autumn was settling over the land when the stranger arrived. Hank was sitting on a stump outside his makeshift cabin, staring unseeing at the distant mountains, when the sound of wagon wheels pulled him reluctantly from his thoughts. He didn't rise to greet the visitor. If he ignored them long enough, they'd leave, just like all the others. But this visitor was different. The wagon came to a stop, and he heard the rustle of skirts as someone descended. Still, he kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his back to the approaching footsteps. "Mr. Montgomery?" The voice was soft, feminine, with a slight Eastern accent that seemed out of place in the rugged territory. Hank didn't answer, hoping his silence would discourage conversation. "My name is Olivia Farrell," she continued, undeterred. "I've taken over the teaching position at the settlement school. The folks in town are worried about you." "They needn't be," Hank muttered, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm fine." "With all due respect, sir, you don't look fine." There was no pity in her tone. Just a straightforward assessment that made him turn despite himself. Olivia Farrell was not what he expected. She was tall for a woman, with auburn hair neatly pinned beneath a practical bonnet. Her dress was simple but well made, the blue fabric complementing eyes that regarded him with intelligence and determination. She wasn't traditionally beautiful, but there was something striking about her features, a strength that spoke of a woman who had faced her own hardships. In her hands, she held a covered pot that steamed in the cool air. "I've brought stew," she said, lifting the pot slightly. "I'm told you haven't been eating properly." "Did the town appoint you my caretaker?" Hank asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "No," she replied evenly. "But I know something about grief, Mr. Montgomery, and I know that sometimes, when a person can't find the will to care for themselves, they need someone else to step in for a while." Before he could protest further, she moved past him to the crude table he'd fashioned from scrap lumber. Setting down the pot, she produced a spoon from her pocket and removed the lid, releasing the rich aroma of beef, vegetables, and herbs into the air. Hank's stomach betrayed him with a loud growl. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a proper meal, subsisting mainly on coffee and whatever game he could shoot without much effort. "Sit," Olivia commanded, her tone brooking no argument. "You need to eat." Too weary to resist, Hank found himself obeying. The first spoonful of stew nearly undid him. It was hearty and flavorful, reminding him that he was still alive, still capable of experiencing something other than pain. Olivia didn't speak as he ate, giving him the dignity of silence. When he finished, she simply took the empty bowl and replaced it with a slice of freshly baked bread. "Why are you doing this?" Hank finally asked, breaking the quiet that had settled between them. Olivia's expression softened slightly. "Because someone once did it for me," she said. "After my husband died in a mining accident in Colorado, I couldn't see past my grief. A neighbor brought me soup every day for weeks until I found my way back to living." Her words hung in the air between them, an unspoken understanding passing from one who had known loss to another. "I don't know if I can find my way back," Hank admitted, the confession torn from somewhere deep within him. "You don't have to find it today," Olivia replied. "Just eat today. Tomorrow, we'll see about tomorrow." She left soon after, but not before informing him that she would return in 2 days with more food. Hank watched her wagon disappear down the rutted path, feeling something stir within him, not hope, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile awareness that the world continued to turn despite his grief. True to her word, Olivia returned 2 days later, this time with a rabbit stew and fresh biscuits. She didn't stay long, seeming to sense that Hank wasn't ready for extended company. But she came again after that, and again, establishing a rhythm to his otherwise formless days. Sometimes she brought books from the small school library, leaving them without comment. Other times, she arrived with practical items: a new shirt to replace his threadbare one, woolen socks for the approaching winter, a cake of soap that smelled of sandalwood. Never charity, always presented as things she happened to have extra of, preserving his pride even as she tended to his needs. October gave way to November, and Hank found himself watching the path for her wagon on the days she was due to visit. He began to make small improvements to his shelter, repairing the roof, adding a proper door, constructing a bench where she could sit during her visits. He started to wash before she arrived, to trim his beard, to wear his cleanest clothes. The first real snowfall came in early December. Hank was chopping wood when he spotted Olivia's wagon struggling through the drifts. Without thinking, he dropped his axe and ran to meet her, concerned about her traveling in such conditions. "You shouldn't have come," he said, taking the reins from her gloved hands. "The roads are dangerous." Olivia's cheeks were flushed with cold, her breath visible in the frigid air. "The children's Christmas pageant is tonight," she said. "I thought you might want to attend." Hank stared at her in disbelief. He hadn't been to town since the funeral, hadn't considered rejoining any community gatherings. "I can't," he said, the familiar weight of grief pressing down on him. Olivia studied his face for a long moment. "Sarah and Emma would want you to live, Hank," she said gently, using his given name for the first time. "Not just exist, but live." Her words struck him like a physical blow. He turned away, unable to face the truth in her eyes. "I'll help you unhitch the horse," he said instead. "You can't go back in this weather. You'll stay until it passes." The storm worsened throughout the afternoon, the wind howling around the small cabin as snow piled against the walls. Hank built up the fire while Olivia prepared the food she'd brought. They ate in companionable silence, and for the first time, Hank found himself wanting to talk, to fill the quiet with something other than the storm's fury. "Emma would have been 6 next month," he said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "She wanted a pony for her birthday. I was training a gentle mare for her, keeping it a surprise." Olivia set down her spoon, giving him her full attention. "What was she like?" she asked softly. No one had asked him that before. They'd offered condolences, expressed sorrow for his loss, but no one had asked about Emma herself, about the bright, curious child who had brought such joy to his life. "She was fearless," Hank said, a small smile tugging at his lips despite the ache in his chest. Always climbing trees, chasing after the barn cats, trying to help with the cattle even though she was barely bigger than a calf herself. She had Sarah's laugh, and my stubbornness. "She sounds wonderful," Olivia said, her eyes warm with genuine interest. She was. Hank took a deep breath. And Sarah was the strongest woman I've ever known. She followed me out here from Kentucky after the war, left behind everything she knew to start over in this wilderness. Never complained, not once, even when that first winter nearly froze us out. The memories came easier now, less painful with each word spoken aloud. He found himself telling Olivia about how he'd met Sarah at a harvest dance back home, about their wedding day, about the long journey west. He told her about Emma's birth during a blizzard much like this one, with only Sarah's determined courage and his terrified assistance bringing their daughter safely into the world. As night fell, Olivia listened, asking questions that gently led him through the story of his life, not just the tragedy that had ended one chapter, but all that had come before. In the telling, Hank felt something shift within him, as if by sharing these memories, he was honoring Sarah and Emma rather than betraying them by continuing to live. When he finally fell silent, the cabin was dark except for the fire's glow. Olivia reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Thank you for telling me about them," she said simply. Hank nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. For the first time since the storm that had taken his family, he felt something like peace settle over him. The blizzard continued through the night. Hank insisted that Olivia take his bed while he slept on a pallet by the fire. As he lay there, listening to the wind and the occasional sound of her movement in the small space, he realized that her presence had brought something back to the cabin that had been missing since he built it. The sense that it was a home, not merely a shelter. Morning brought clear skies and a transformed landscape, the world blanketed in pristine white. After a simple breakfast, Hank helped Olivia prepare for her return journey, clearing a path to the barn and hitching her horse to the wagon. "Will you come back?" he asked as he handed her up to the seat, surprising himself with the question. Olivia smiled, the winter sun catching in her auburn hair. "I always do, don't I?" "Yes," he agreed. "You do." As her wagon pulled away, Hank stood watching until it disappeared from view. Then, instead of returning to his solitary existence, he walked to the shed where he kept his tools. There was work to be done if he was going to make this place a proper home before winter's grip tightened further. The weeks that followed marked a slow but steady change in Hank's life. He began to rebuild not on the site of the old house, which he still couldn't bear to reclaim, but in a clearing nearby, where the view of the mountains was particularly fine. Sarah had always loved that spot, saying it made her feel close to heaven. Between Olivia's visits, he threw himself into the work, felling trees, squaring logs, laying foundations. Physical exhaustion helped him sleep at night, and for the first time in months, his dreams weren't always haunted by flames and loss. Olivia came whenever her teaching duties allowed, sometimes bringing students' parents who were skilled carpenters or stonemasons, eager to help a neighbor in need. Hank, who had rejected all assistance before, now accepted it with awkward gratitude, recognizing the genuine goodwill behind the offers. As Christmas approached, the basic structure of the new cabin was complete, smaller than his previous home, but solid and well-crafted. When Olivia arrived on the Saturday before Christmas, she brought not only food, but also a small pine tree and a box of simple ornaments made by her students. "The children wanted you to have these," she explained as Hank examined the paper stars and painted pine cones. "They've heard about you rebuilding, and they thought your new home should have Christmas cheer." Touched by the gesture, Hank set up the tree in the corner of the cabin. Together, he and Olivia hung the handmade decorations, their fingers occasionally brushing in a way that sent an unexpected warmth through him. "I have something for you as well," Olivia said when they finished, reaching into her bag to produce a carefully wrapped package. Hank opened it to find a finely crafted leather-bound journal, the pages blank and waiting. "For your memories," she said softly, "and for whatever comes next." The thoughtfulness of the gift left him momentarily speechless. When he could finally speak, his voice was rough with emotion. "I don't have anything for you." Olivia shook her head. "You've already given me something, Hank. You let me help. That's no small thing for a proud man to do." Later, as they shared a meal by the fire, Hank found himself studying Olivia with new awareness. In the months since she'd first arrived with her pot of stew, he'd come to depend on her visits, to value her quiet strength and undemanding companionship. But tonight, watching the firelight play across her features, he realized that what he felt had grown into something more, something he wasn't sure he had the right to feel, not with Sarah's memory still so present. "Tell me about your husband," he said suddenly, needing to shift his thoughts. "You mentioned he died in a mining accident, but you've never spoken much about him." A shadow crossed Olivia's face, but she didn't deflect the question. "Thomas was a dreamer," she said, her gaze distant with remembrance. "Always chasing the next big strike. We met in St. Louis. I was teaching there, and he was passing through on his way to the Colorado goldfields. He convinced me that adventure awaited in the West." She smiled faintly. "He wasn't wrong about that, though perhaps not in the way he meant. We had 3 good years together before the mine collapse. He was kind and he loved me, but he was restless, always looking to the horizon." "And after?" Hank asked gently. "After, I stayed in the mining town for a while, teaching the children there. But when the mines began to play out and families started leaving, I knew I needed to move on as well." She met his eyes. "That's when I saw the advertisement for a teacher needed in Montana Territory. It seemed as good a direction as any. Do you regret it? Coming here?" Olivia considered the question, then shook her head decisively. "No. This place has its challenges, but there's an honesty to it that I've come to value. The people here don't pretend to be what they're not." Her words resonated with Hank. It was one of the things he'd always appreciated about the territory, the lack of pretense, the straightforward nature of both the land and those who chose to make their lives upon it. "Will you stay?" he asked, the question heavy with meaning beyond the immediate conversation. Olivia held his gaze steadily. "I've signed a contract to teach through the spring term. After that, I suppose it depends on whether I have reason to stay." The implication hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Hank nodded, not trusting himself to respond without revealing more than he was ready to acknowledge. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold. Hank rose early, tending to his few remaining cattle and the horses before returning to the cabin. On impulse, he retrieved the small wooden box he kept beneath his bed, the few treasures he'd managed to salvage from the ruins of his former home. Inside was Sarah's silver locket, blackened by smoke but still intact, containing miniature portraits of herself and Emma. For the first time since the fire, he opened it, looking at the faces of his wife and daughter without the crushing weight of despair. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had changed somehow, becoming a part of him rather than consuming him entirely. "I miss you both," he whispered to the tiny images. "I'll always miss you. But I think I'm finding my way back to living, like you'd want me to." He closed the locket gently and returned it to the box, feeling as though he'd received a silent blessing. Later that morning, he hitched his horse to the small sleigh he'd repaired for the occasion and drove into town for the Christmas service. He'd avoided the settlement since the funeral, dreading the sympathetic glances and well-meaning inquiries about his welfare. But today, bolstered by months of gradual healing and Olivia's steady presence in his life, he felt ready to rejoin the community. The small church was crowded when he arrived. Families packed into the pews in their Sunday best, Heads turned as he entered, and there was a momentary hush before the minister nodded warmly in greeting and continued with the service. Hank spotted Olivia seated near the front with some of her students. She looked up as if sensing his presence, her face lighting with surprise and pleasure when she saw him. He slipped into an empty space at the back, uncomfortable with the attention but determined to stay. After the service, there was a community dinner in the meeting hall. Hank had intended to return home immediately, but Olivia found him before he could make his escape. "You came," she said, her smile warming him more effectively than the pot-bellied stove that heated the church. "I did," he agreed, suddenly glad of his decision despite his discomfort. It seemed time. She tucked her hand into the crook of his arm with a naturalness that belied the significance of the gesture. "Come eat with us. The children have been asking about you ever since they made those ornaments." Unable to refuse her, Hank found himself drawn into the gathering, introduced to students eager to hear if he liked their decorations, seated at a table with other ranchers who spoke of cattle prices and weather predictions rather than his personal tragedy. Gradually, the knot of tension in his chest began to ease. These people weren't viewing him with pity. They were simply welcoming him back into the fold of the living. Olivia moved through the crowd with easy grace, clearly respected and liked by the townspeople. Watching her interact with her students and their parents, Hank was struck by how seamlessly she had integrated herself into the community in the short time she'd been there. She belonged here in a way he once had, before grief had isolated him. As the celebration wound down and families began to depart, Hank approached Olivia with an invitation that had been forming in his mind throughout the afternoon. "Would you allow me to drive you home?" he asked, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since courting Sarah as a young man. "I brought the sleigh." Olivia's eyes brightened at the offer. "I'd like that very much," she said, reaching for her coat and bonnet. The afternoon sun cast long blue shadows across the snow as they left town, the sleigh runners cutting smooth tracks in the pristine surface. Olivia sat close beside him, both for warmth and because the small seat allowed for little distance between them. The scent of lavender from her hair mingled with the crisp winter air, creating a moment of perfect clarity in Hank's mind. He was happy, truly happy, for the first time in many months. They talked easily as they traveled, about the Christmas celebration, about Olivia's students, about Hank's progress on the new cabin. When they reached the small house at the edge of town that the school board had provided for the teachers' use, Hank helped her down from the sleigh, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for coming today," Olivia said, looking up at him with those direct blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "It meant a great deal to many people to see you there." "Including you?" Hank asked, his voice low. "Especially me," she admitted, a faint blush coloring her cheeks despite the cold. Impulsively, Hank reached into his pocket and withdrew a small carved wooden horse, fashioned during the long evenings alone in his cabin. "Merry Christmas, Olivia," he said, placing it in her gloved hand. "It's not much, but—" "It's beautiful," she interrupted, examining the figure with obvious appreciation for the craftsmanship. "Did you make this?" Hank nodded, unexpectedly pleased by her reaction. "My father taught me whittling when I was a boy. I haven't done much of it in years, but lately—" He shrugged, not needing to explain that the peaceful evenings working with his hands had been part of his healing. "Thank you," Olivia said softly. Then, rising on her toes, she pressed a quick, gentle kiss to his cheek before turning to enter her house. Hank stood motionless for a long moment after the door closed behind her, his hand rising to touch the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. The simple gesture had awakened something within him that he'd thought long dead, the capacity for tenderness, for desire, for hope. As he drove back to his homestead through the gathering dusk, Hank felt as though he were returning to a different place than the one he'd left that morning, not because the land had changed, but because he had. The future, which for so long had seemed nothing but a bleak extension of his suffering, now held possibilities he was almost ready to embrace. Winter deepened its hold on the territory as January gave way to February. Heavy snows made travel difficult. But Hank and Olivia maintained their connection through notes carried by the mail carrier, who braved the weather once a week to deliver correspondence to the outlying homesteads. Her letters were like windows into her world, stories of her students' progress, observations about town life, and increasingly, personal reflections that revealed the depth and thoughtfulness of her mind. Hank found himself writing more than he ever had before, filling pages with descriptions of the wildlife he observed around his property, progress reports on the cabin construction, and gradually, his own thoughts about the future. The journal she had given him for Christmas became a faithful companion, its pages receiving the words he wasn't yet ready to speak aloud: his growing feelings for Olivia, his fears about honoring Sarah's memory while moving forward, his hopes for building a new life that would incorporate his loss without being defined by it. By mid-February, the worst of the winter storms had passed, making travel between the homestead and town possible again. When Olivia arrived one Saturday morning, Hank was putting the finishing touches on the porch railing of the now completed cabin. "It's finished," she said, taking in the sight of the sturdy structure with its stone chimney and wide windows. "Hank, it's wonderful." Pride surged through him as he helped her down from the wagon. "Want to see inside?" The interior was simple but carefully crafted: a main room with a stone fireplace, a small bedroom off to one side, storage space built into the walls. Olivia moved through the space, running her hand appreciatively over the smooth, planed surfaces of the furniture Hank had built. "You've created something beautiful here," she said, turning to face him with genuine admiration. "Something lasting." "It still needs a woman's touch," Hank replied, then felt heat rise to his face as he realized the implication of his words. I know what you mean," Olivia said, saving him from his awkwardness. She set down the basket she'd brought and began unpacking its contents: a checkered tablecloth, a vase with dried wildflowers preserved from the fall, curtains she'd sewn for the windows. "I thought you might be able to use these." Together, they transformed the bare cabin into something that felt like a home, hanging the curtains, setting the table, arranging the few books and personal items Hank possessed on the shelves he'd built. The work was companionable, their movements around each other becoming more natural with each passing hour. As afternoon light slanted through the new curtains, they sat at the table sharing the meal Olivia had brought. There was an intimacy to the moment that went beyond their physical proximity, the sense of having created something together, of sharing a vision of what this space could be. "I've been thinking," Hank said, gathering his courage, "about what comes next. The spring calving will start soon, and I'll need to expand the herd if I'm going to make this place profitable again." Olivia nodded, listening attentively as she always did. "And I've been thinking about what you said at Christmas about whether you had reason to stay beyond your teaching contract." He met her eyes directly. "I'd like to give you that reason, Olivia." Her breath caught audibly, but she didn't look away. "What are you saying, Hank?" "I'm saying that I care for you. Deeply." The words, once spoken, seemed to release something within him. "I never expected to feel this way again after Sarah died. I thought that part of me was gone forever. But you brought me back to life with a pot of stew, and your stubborn refusal to let me waste away in my grief." A smile touched Olivia's lips, though her eyes were serious. "Is that all I did?" Hank shook his head. "No. You made me laugh again. You listened when I needed to remember, and you pushed when I needed to move forward. You showed me that there could be a future worth living for." He reached across the table to take her hand. "I'm not asking for promises now. I know it's too soon, and we both carry our pasts with us. But I wanted you to know that when your teaching contract ends in the spring, there's a place for you here, if you want it." Olivia turned her hand in his so their fingers interlaced. "What if I don't want to wait until spring?" she asked softly. Hank's heart pounded in his chest. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I care for you too, Hank Montgomery. I have since that day I found you sitting on a stump, too lost in grief to even look at me." Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering. "I didn't come here looking for love. After Thomas died, I thought I was content with my independence, with dedicating myself to teaching. But then I met you, and everything changed." Hank stood, drawing her up with him, needing to be closer. "Olivia, I'm not asking you to forget Sarah," she continued, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. "I would never want that. She will always be a part of you, just as Thomas is a part of me. But I think there's room in a heart for more than one love in a lifetime." Unable to find words adequate to express what he was feeling, Hank did the only thing that made sense. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, questioning touch that deepened when she responded with equal fervor. Her arms wound around his neck as his encircled her waist, holding her close as if she might disappear if he let go. When they finally parted, both breathless, Hank rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered. "Not just today, but always." Olivia's smile was radiant. "I will," she promised, "but we have to do things properly. I have my reputation as the schoolteacher to consider." Hank laughed, the sound filling the cabin with joy. "Miss Farrell, are you saying I need to make an honest woman of you?" "Mr. Montgomery," she replied with mock severity. "I'm saying that if you want me to stay, you'd better have a proper proposal in mind." The light in her eyes told him she was teasing, but Hank recognized the wisdom in her words. They had time now, time to court properly, to learn each other's ways, to build something solid and lasting together. "Then consider yourself officially courted, Miss Farrell," he said, bowing with exaggerated formality before pulling her close again, starting immediately. The weeks that followed were a revelation for Hank. He'd forgotten the sweet anticipation of courtship, the pleasure of planning outings designed to bring a smile to a woman's face, the thrill of discovering another person's thoughts and dreams and aligning them with his own. Despite the remaining winter weather, they found countless ways to spend time together. Hank drove into town several evenings a week to escort Olivia to community suppers or simply to sit with her by her fire, talking late into the night. On weekends, she came to the homestead, helping him prepare for the spring planting and the calving season ahead. Together they visited Sarah and Emma's graves, Olivia standing respectfully aside as Hank spoke quietly to his first family, telling them about his new happiness, seeking their blessing in his heart. She understood, without him having to explain, that this pilgrimage was necessary, not a dwelling in the past, but a bridge between what had been and what could be. March brought the first signs of spring snowmelt swelling the creeks, early wildflowers pushing through the softening earth, longer days filled with strengthening sunlight. As the land renewed itself, Hank felt his own rebirth continuing, each day bringing fresh appreciation for the life he now had and the woman who had helped him reclaim it. On the first truly warm Saturday in April, Hank arrived at Olivia's house with a carefully considered plan. He'd spent weeks preparing for this day, wanting everything to be perfect. "I thought we might have a picnic," he suggested, indicating the basket he'd brought. "The meadow above the creek should be dry enough now." Olivia agreed readily, changing from her house dress into a pretty blue walking outfit that brought out the color of her eyes. As they rode towards the spot Hank had chosen, she commented on the new growth visible everywhere, the fresh green of budding trees, the early blossoms dotting the landscape. "Everything comes back," she said, a note of wonder in her voice, despite having witnessed many spring renewals in her 30 years. "No matter how harsh the winter, life returns." "Yes," Hank agreed, thinking of his own journey from the devastation of loss to the promise of new beginnings. It always does. The meadow he'd selected offered a panoramic view of the surrounding countryside, including both his homestead in the distance and the small settlement where Olivia taught. Here, where the two parts of their lives were visible together, seemed the perfect place for what he had planned. They spread a blanket on the sun-warmed grass and unpacked the meal Hank had prepared: cold chicken, bread still warm from the oven, early spring vegetables, and a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion. As they ate, they talked about the future, the summer ahead, plans for expanding the ranch, Olivia's ideas for improving the school. When they finished eating, Hank reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I have something for you," he said, suddenly nervous despite their months of growing closeness. Olivia's eyes widened as she accepted the box, opening it to reveal a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect sapphire. "It was my mother's," Hank explained. "My father gave it to me before he died, said I should give it to the woman who would share my life." He took a deep breath. "I had it sized for you. The jeweler in Helena did the work when I went to order supplies last month." Olivia looked from the ring to his face, her expression a mixture of joy and uncertainty. "Hank." He took her hands in his. "Olivia Farrell, you came into my life when I was at my lowest point, and you brought me back to myself with your kindness, your strength, and your stubborn determination not to let me fade away. I love you for that, and for 1,000 other reasons I discover every day we're together." Tears glistened in Olivia's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I'm asking you to marry me," Hank confirmed, his voice strong and sure. "To build a life with me on this land, to face whatever comes together, the good years and the hard ones. I'm asking you to be my wife, my partner, my heart's companion for all the days we're given." Olivia's answer was to throw her arms around his neck, nearly toppling them both onto the blanket. "Yes," she whispered against his ear. "Yes to all of it, Hank Montgomery." He slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how right it looked there, as if it had been waiting all along for this moment. When he kissed her, it was with the certainty that his future, their future, was beginning here, in this meadow, on this perfect spring day. They were married in the small church in town 3 weeks later, with the entire community turning out to celebrate. The school children formed an honor guard for their beloved teacher, scattering flower petals as she walked down the aisle in a dress of ivory silk that she'd ordered from a catalog and altered herself to fit perfectly. Hank, standing at the altar in his best suit, felt a momentary pang as he thought of his first wedding day, Sarah radiant in her mother's gown, both of them so young and full of hope for the life ahead. But as Olivia approached, her eyes fixed on his with such love and certainty, the pang transformed into gratitude for having been blessed twice in one lifetime with a love worth building a life around. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows spoken clearly for all to hear. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the congregation seemed to lift the very rafters of the church, a community's blessing on a union that many had watched develop with approval and support. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and enough food to feed half the territory. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit in the town square, casting a golden glow over the festivities. Hank held his new wife close as they danced beneath the stars, her head resting against his shoulder in a gesture of trust and belonging that moved him deeply. "Happy?" he murmured against her hair. Olivia lifted her face to his, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. "Completely," she assured him. "And you?" "More than I ever thought possible again," he answered honestly. Later, as they drove back to the homestead, their home now, Hank felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. The road ahead would have its challenges, as all lives do, but they would face them together. drawing strength from each other and from the love they had found when neither was looking for it. The cabin welcomed them with warm light spilling from the windows. Olivia's father, who had traveled from St. Louis for the wedding, had gone ahead to light the lamps and build up the fire before discreetly departing for town. Inside, the space they had furnished together over the past months awaited them, no longer just a structure but truly a home. Hank lifted Olivia across the threshold, an old tradition honored in this new beginning. Setting her gently on her feet, he kept his arms around her, savoring the knowledge that from this night forward they would share this space and all the days and nights to come. "Welcome home, Mrs. Montgomery," he said softly. Olivia's smile held all the promise of their future. "I am home," she replied, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Wherever you are, that's my home now." The seasons turned, as seasons do, each bringing its own joys and challenges to the growing ranch. Spring became summer, with long days spent tending the expanding herd and cultivating the vegetable garden that Olivia had planted beside the cabin. Summer yielded to fall, the landscape transforming into a tapestry of gold and crimson as they harvested the garden's bounty and prepared for the winter ahead. Olivia had resigned her teaching position after their marriage, though she continued to tutor several students who rode out to the ranch twice a week for lessons. The school board had been reluctant to lose her, but they understood the demands of a rancher's wife and the distance that made daily travel to town impractical. As winter approached again, bringing with it the anniversary of the storm that had claimed Hank's first family, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this new life. The grief was still there, a quiet presence that would always be part of him, but it no longer defined his days. Instead, it had become a tributary flowing into the wider river of his existence, acknowledged, respected, but not allowed to overflow its banks and flood the landscape of his heart. Olivia understood this balance better than anyone. On the anniversary itself, she suggested they ride together to the graves beneath the cottonwood tree, bringing fresh evergreen boughs to mark the site now that snow covered the ground. They stood together in the winter stillness, Hank's arm around his wife's shoulders as he spoke quietly to Sarah and Emma, telling them about the year that had passed, the growth of the ranch, the happiness he had found. "They know," Olivia said softly as they turned to leave. "Wherever they are, they know you're living well, and they're at peace." Hank pressed a kiss to her temple, grateful beyond words for her wisdom and her generous heart. "I believe that too," he said, "and I believe they would have liked you very much." "I hope so," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "I've come to love them through your stories, through the ways they shaped the man you are." The knowledge that she could speak of Sarah and Emma with such genuine affection, without jealousy or insecurity, reinforced Hank's certainty that he had found a remarkable woman in Olivia. Many might have wanted him to lock away his past, to pretend that his life began anew with their marriage. Instead, she had helped him integrate his loss into their shared present, creating a foundation for their future that honored all that had come before. That winter evening, as they sat by the fire in their snug cabin, Olivia with her mending and Hank with a new piece of wood he was carving, she cleared her throat with uncharacteristic hesitation. "I've been meaning to tell you something," she said, setting aside her work. "I wasn't sure at first. Wanted to be certain before I said anything." Hank looked up, noting the mixture of nervousness and joy in her expression. "What is it?" Olivia took a deep breath, her hand moving instinctively to rest on her stomach. "We're going to have a child, Hank. In late spring, the doctor thinks." The carving knife stilled in Hank's hand as her words registered. A child. They were going to have a child together. Emotions cascaded through him. Joy, wonder, a momentary flash of fear quickly replaced by overwhelming gratitude. Setting aside his work, he moved to kneel beside her chair, placing his hand over hers where it rested. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." Olivia nodded, tears of happiness shining in her eyes. "Are you pleased?" In answer, Hank gathered her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that conveyed what words could not fully express. "Please doesn't begin to cover it," he murmured against her hair. I'm overwhelmed, in the best possible way." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's embrace, contemplating the new life that would join their family in the months ahead. When they finally separated, Hank placed a gentle hand on Olivia's still flat abdomen, marveling at the miracle growing within. "Boy or girl, it doesn't matter," he said, "as long as the child has your heart and your spirit." "And your strength and your kindness," Olivia added, covering his hand with her own. "This baby will be loved, Hank. So very loved." "Yes," he agreed, thinking of all they would teach this child about courage and perseverance, about loss and renewal, about the capacity of the human heart to heal and expand. More than they'll ever know. The winter passed in a haze of anticipation and preparation. Hank threw himself into building a cradle, fashioning it from the finest wood he could find, carving delicate patterns along the rails and rockers. Olivia sewed tiny garments in the evenings, her skilled hands creating practical but beautiful clothes for the baby they already loved so fiercely. As her body changed with the growing child, Hank found himself filled with wonder at the process of creation unfolding before him. He had experienced this once before, with Sarah. But time had dulled some of the details, and seeing Olivia blossom with their child was a fresh marvel, a new chapter in their shared story. Spring arrived earlier than usual that year, as if nature herself was eager to welcome their child into a world of renewal and growth. The meadows greened, wildflowers carpeted the hillsides, and the creek ran full and clear with snowmelt from the mountains. Olivia's time came on a perfect May morning, with sunshine streaming through the cabin windows and birdsong filling the air. The midwife from town had arrived the previous evening, sensing that the birth was near, and Hank had dispatched a ranch hand to fetch the doctor as well, unwilling to take any chances with the safety of his wife and child. Unlike Emma's birth, which had happened during a blizzard with only Hank to help Sarah through her labor, this delivery was attended by experienced hands. Still, Hank refused to leave Olivia's side, supporting her through each contraction, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement as she worked to bring their child into the world. After hours of labor that tested Olivia's endurance and Hank's composure, their daughter was born just as the sun reached its zenith. The midwife placed the squalling infant on Olivia's chest, and Hank watched in awe as his wife's exhausted face transformed with love for the tiny, perfect being they had created together. "She's beautiful," Olivia whispered, tracing a gentle finger over the baby's downy head. "Look what we did, Hank." Hank couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. Instead, he leaned down to press a reverent kiss to Olivia's forehead, then to the crown of his daughter's head, breathing in the indescribable scent of new life. When the midwife had cleaned and swaddled the baby, and the doctor had confirmed that both mother and child were doing well, Hank finally found his voice again. "What shall we name her?" he asked, cradling their daughter with careful hands that had known both violence in war and tenderness in love. Olivia's eyes met his, steady and sure despite her exhaustion. "I was thinking we might call her Hope," she said, "because that's what she represents for us, for this family we're building together." "Hope," Hank repeated, testing the name on his tongue and finding it perfect. "Hope Montgomery." He looked down at the sleeping infant in his arms, her tiny features relaxed in the absolute trust of the newly born. "Welcome to the world, little one. You have quite a story to inherit." In the days that followed, their cabin was filled with visitors bringing gifts and good wishes for the new arrival. The community that had supported them through their courtship and marriage now celebrated this next chapter in their lives, reinforcing the sense of belonging that had grown stronger with each passing season. Hank found fatherhood both familiar and entirely new. There were moments when holding Hope triggered memories of Emma as an infant, the same overwhelming protectiveness, the same wonder at tiny fingers and toes. But there were also fresh discoveries, new joys specific to this child and this time in his life. At night, he often stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching Olivia nurse their daughter, the two of them illuminated by soft lamplight. In those quiet moments, gratitude would wash over him with such force that it nearly brought him to his knees. Gratitude for the second chance at happiness he'd been given, for the woman who had walked up his path with a pot of stew and an unwavering determination to help him find his way back to living. As Hope grew from newborn to infant, developing a personality that combined Olivia's curiosity with Hank's quiet determination, the ranch prospered alongside their family. The cattle herd expanded, requiring additional hands to manage during the busy seasons. The original cabin was enlarged with new rooms to accommodate their growing needs. A barn raising brought neighbors from miles around, resulting in a structure large enough to shelter their increasing livestock and store the abundant hay harvested from their fields. On Hope's first birthday, they hosted a celebration that drew people from throughout the area. Tables were set up beneath the cottonwood trees, laden with food prepared by Olivia and the neighboring women. Children played games on the grassy expanse in front of the cabin, their laughter mingling with the sounds of adults catching up on local news and the gentle lowing of cattle in the distant pastures. Watching his daughter toddle from guest to guest, charming everyone with her bright smile and inquisitive nature, Hank felt a sense of completion he had once thought forever beyond his reach. His life had come full circle from the devastating loss that had nearly destroyed him to this moment of pure joy, surrounded by family and community, rooted in love and purpose. Olivia appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his with the easy familiarity of deep connection. "What are you thinking about so seriously, husband?" she asked, following his gaze to their daughter. "How fortunate I am," Hank replied honestly. "How blessed we all are." Olivia leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture that still had the power to warm him from within. "Yes," she agreed, "though I think fortune had less to do with it than courage yours in allowing yourself to live again, mine in bringing that first pot of stew to a grief-stricken stranger." Hank turned to face her fully, taking in the features that had become as essential to him as his own reflection, the clear blue eyes that saw so deeply, the generous mouth that spoke wisdom and love in equal measure, the strong line of her jaw that hinted at the determination beneath her gentle exterior. "That wasn't just stew you brought," he said, his voice low and sincere. "It was the future, our future." Olivia's smile held all the warmth of the summer day around them. And what a beautiful future it's turning out to be. As they stood together watching their daughter explore her world with boundless enthusiasm, Hank knew with absolute certainty that the storm that had once taken everything from him had, in its terrible way, also led him to this new life. He would never be grateful for the tragedy itself, but he could acknowledge that from the darkest night of his existence had come the dawn of unexpected joy. The past and present existed side by side within him, now the memory of what was lost preserved with reverence, the reality of what had been found celebrated with thanksgiving. Both were essential parts of who he had become, a man who understood the preciousness of life precisely because he knew its fragility. "Look, Papa," Hope called, toddling toward them with a wildflower clutched in her chubby hand. "For you." Hank scooped up his daughter, accepting her gift with appropriate solemnity. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said, tucking the flower into his shirt pocket. "It's perfect." Over Hope's dark curls, his eyes met Olivia's. the love between them a tangible force binding their family together. In that moment, with his daughter in his arms and his wife by his side, Hank Montgomery, once broken by loss, now healed by love, understood that this was what it meant to be truly home.